Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now I've done Chaos Cultists on the channel before and I painted them very quickly. Today what I'm going to do is something a little different. This is a little bit more involved than ordinarily. The techniques used are still going to be very simple though. All I'm going to do is one mix through the whole thing. Otherwise it's just layering paint one step on top of the other. Talk a little bit about color choices as we go, and I think you'll be surprised by the primer. So all of the paints will be listed in the description below. Let's get started. It might be a little bit of a surprise, but I've started with Barbarian Flesh from the Army Painter as the primer spray here. Reason being, her skin is going to be the lowest coat of color on the entire miniature. Everything is layered over the top of that. And if I've got a skin tone laid down straight away, it actually saves me a bit of painting later on. If you can't get your hands on Army Painter stuff, you could as easily use here Wraithbone and put a coat of Guilliman Flesh or whatever you like over the top of it. Start from the skin is going to be the easiest example, but since I've got that primer, that's what I've used. And then talking about layers, we're going to start painting from the next layer up. So what I have here, this is Warp Fiend Grey, and it's got a purpley sort of tone to it. And we're just going to paint this over some of the areas of, fabric. Because it's got a little bit of purple to it, people are going to go, oh, but is she Slaaneshi? It's like, no, because color doesn't necessarily attach these guys immediately to a Chaos God. But I would suggest that if you want to make them a little bit more, let's say generic, then something like Dawnstone here would probably work quite well in this place. I like the little bit of color that Warp Fiend Grey has. And once we've applied the other colors, it's not going to look very purple by comparison. So we'll move on now to the leather details. And for this, I'm going to use Thondir Brown. You could as easily here use Mournfang Brown or something similar if you wanted a lighter finish. But I quite like Thondir Brown for a really dark leather. Slow down a little as you come near her midriff. And obviously on some of the other cultists, they're going to have exposed chests and what have you, so try not to splurge on over the areas of skin that you don't want to have to tidy up. But take your time, and any leather bits, lay down some Thondir Brown. You will likely find that still takes 2 coats in most areas, but that's quite a nice brown. Nice and deep, but we can still shade it and get a little bit of variation. What I'm turning to now, this is Black Grey from Vallejo. If you want to stick to Citadel, this is basically Corvus Black, but the coverage on this is just much better. I tend to find anyhow. So I'm going to apply this over her trousers, mostly because, same as with the brown, I want to be able to shade this with something and have it look a little more interesting than a pure black would. And as well as the trousers, I'm also going to paint in her hair, although I will probably swap to a larger brush to do that. So you'll see we have black, but not quite, which gives us a little we can do on the shading front. I'm going to move on now to the metallic details, and for this, no great surprise, I'm going to use Leadbelcher, although the Army Painter's gunmetal would also work quite well here. I'm going to stick to one of the STC brushes. This is the synthetics. And the reason isn't that they're indestructible, because they will eventually lose their point, but they tend to be quite stiff bristled, so I can jam them in where I want that color to really settle, and they won't splay and have bristles go in every which direction. So everywhere that I want to be silver metallic, on goes a coat of Leadbelcher. Now, there is quite a lot of metallic stuff on the miniature, and I've given most of it 2 coats just to make sure that the primer isn't showing through. There is one exception, and I've laid down the Leadbelcher first on it, but on the Grotesque, the mask she's wearing, I'm going to now go on with a coat of Iron Hand Steel. Reason being, I want a lighter, shinier finish for this than the rest of the gear she's wearing. Now, here is the point when you want to start thinking a little bit about what colors you want to use, because we've been painting mostly generic stuff so far, equipment and clothing. But when you get to armor and this big cape thing she's wearing, on your cultists, this is an opportunity to lay down the alignment that they are with. Which chaos god do they see themselves as following? So here I might turn to Death Guard green and a brassy color. Or I might use Macragge blue if I want a Tzeentchian cultist. You know, there's not really a correct answer to this one. But personally, I do quite like the Chaos Undivided look for cultists. I like the idea that they're not really permitted to wear the trappings of a god yet. So what I'm using is black. This is from Vallejo, and for the same reason as the black grey we used earlier. Just look at how that covers. So I'm going to paint in her armor piece here, and I'm going to paint in the weapons, their casings in black as well. Now in the same vein, thinking about what color to do the cloak she's wearing is another opportunity where you can put in some color. Now any color is going to be associated with a Chaos God. You know, if I put red, you're going to say Khorne. If I put blue, Tzeentch, and so forth. So I do quite like the middle ground that the Heavy Metal team used, which is Galvorbak red. Now this is not quite burgundy, it's not quite red, so it doesn't really look like, it's not ornate, it's not quite Slaaneshi. I like it. I might have thinned down my paint a little bit too much there, but this is going to take 2 coats anyhow. So all over this section here, and at the front, this very busy section where all of the cords and sigils and what have you are, this is why we're painting this section before we get onto the gold and brass. Now here, don't make the same mistake I did and thin that down too much. That is 3 coats. It should go on in 2 though. Just make sure that you're letting the first one dry thoroughly before you apply the second. What I've got now, we're going to turn to some gold. I have Retributor armor. Although if you wanted a much deeper brassy color, what you could use would be Balthazar gold instead. But I want a little bit of light, a little bit of shine, so I'm going to apply this just to a few select spots where I want this nice gold color. Now there are quite a few bits on her that you can paint gold if you want to, a lot of trim. So take your time, slow down, but don't worry too much if you do splurge over anything, because we're still at a point where we can happily just go back to our base coats to tidy up. Now at this point, there's really only a couple of things left to do. First off, I'm going to use Evil Sun Scarlet. We're going to go all the way up to a nice bright red and just paint in the horns. And finally, some Wraithbone. I'm going to use this to paint in the cords on her sigil here. Now, once I've done this, I'm going to cruise around and make sure that I have tidied up anything or splurged over a little bit. And in particular, if you're priming with a spray color, Barbarian Flesh in this instance rather, make sure that you have got that same color in a pot, because it'll make it much easier to tidy up if you have to. Now before we apply this scabby looking shade in the background here, I want to talk about it just a little. This is what I've always called marine juice. It's lifted from the Forge World army painting team. What it is an equal mix of Nuln Oil, Reikland Flesh Shade, and Lamian Medium. Now importantly, and why I wanted to mention it, is that folks have been using the new shades and have mentioned that with the addition of the medium, it looks very similar. So don't worry too much if you haven't got the old stuff. I've got a bunch of it, so I'm going to keep using it. The reason why I'm using this rather than something like Agrax Earthshade is I want just a subtle bit of warmth, which the Reikland Flesh Shade will give us here. You can just as easily use Agrax Earthshade, but I would suggest thin it down a little bit by adding a little medium. So I'm going to load up my brush and quite generously here, start applying this over the entire miniature. Really work it in, and then, same as always, once this is applied, we'll leave her somewhere sunny for about half an hour to dry. And then once she has dried, you'll have something that looks like this, which, nice, there's just enough shading that it looks a little more three-dimensional, but not so much so that it really tints the color over much. But of course we can take it a little further than this. So what I'm going to do is straight away grab some Necron Compound and just a little old dry brush. Don't need very much of this at all. What I'm going to do is once I've got most of it off into a bit of kitchen towel, I'm just going to lightly dry brush along the edges of the weapons. Just enough to pick out the edges, make them look a little shinier. And then we'll do the same thing with some Dawnstone and do that over her hair. Now don't push down too hard on this, otherwise you're going to snap that hair, and at this point Man, oh man, you don't want to do that. Now at that point, there's not much of a reason you couldn't base her up and call her done. But from here, there are a couple of extra things which you can take or leave. Whichever part of these you think looks good, go ahead and do it. If you don't like it, skip it. What I have is Word Bearer's Red, and I'm going to scratch in just some of the edges of the red part that we've done so far. And I'm seeing now that there are actually studs in the bottom of her cape that I should have painted. Whoops. I'll grab those with a little bit of Iron Hand Steel in a minute. Now I have here Slanesh Grey, which is really a very sort of faded, pale pinkish color. Really good for highlighting our Warp Fiend Grey from earlier. If you do want to avoid leaning back into the purple, you could actually use here Administratum Grey instead, but I'm going to use just a little of this to pick out some of the edges and the corners of this top she's wearing. Now, as with anything, if you make a mistake there, you can just go back to the base color and tidy up your highlights if you have to. For the leather, I'm actually going to use Mournfang Brown as my highlight. Now, I've watered this down to the point it's running on my palette like a layer paint would. So I can now get in, start very carefully at this point, just painting along the edges of those leather straps. Now when you're painting that, one thing to bear in mind is if you leave a ragged edge, like don't paint a single straight line along the edge of a highlight, little ragged nips and tucks and scratches is going to give it the look of more worn leather. So don't worry if you can't paint a perfect straight line. I've got now Kislev flesh, and I'm just going to dot in the backs of her knuckles. I'll also pick the areas at the edge of a few muscles, just to make her look a little more buff. And then on to the last final couple of highlights. I have Stormhost Silver, and I'm going to add just a tiny touch of this to her mask. So up around the brows, along that pointy chin, highlighting it similarly to how I would a face. Now, if I make any mistakes here, I can just jam a little bit of my shade over it again, and it will not matter. Now, I'll admit, as well as her face, I did go a little overboard and did in the skull on her shoulder there. What I've got next, this is some Stormhost Silver again, mixed in about 2 parts Sycorax Bronze to 1 Stormhost Silver. You can use Retributor Armor, mix Retributor Armor with that silver, but I want a brassy touch to the highlights that I'm going to do on this gold stuff. Now at that point, if you want to avoid having to mix anything, you could try Liberator Gold instead. As always, I'm doing it for a reason. I think the mixes will look a little nicer. And especially for your champion, why not push the boat out just a little? So I know I said those were the last highlights, but I have here Tuskgore Fur. I'm going to use this as a final highlight on the red, because I don't think that's really popping quite as I would like. Ah, there we go. Right. I'm going to go around and scratch up some of these highlights with just a little Tuskgore Fur, and I will remember to put those bleeding metal studs in. Now at last, I'm going to call her finished. I think you can probably tell this is at the point where I was just faffing about and having fun, but like I said, there's stages that you can drop if you don't fancy them, or really pay attention to those bits that you want to stand out. So what I'm going to do now is take her outside, I'm going to hit her with a matte varnish spray, pop a base on her, let's see what she looks like when she is all finished. And there at last, our Chaos Cultist champion is complete. And I hope if you take away anything from today, it's that if something seems daunting, don't look at the whole thing at once. Have a think, break it down, what is the lowest layer and where are you going to start from? Just spend a few minutes before grabbing the paints and lay out what you've got in mind, what you're trying to achieve, and think about what step is going to follow each. It will break these things down into something much more approachable. So, as always, thank you very much to Exit 23 Games for the light and sound equipment, as well as all of my wonderful patrons who are keeping me ticking in paints and glue, including my producers, Alan Nuttall, Kyrie Crawford, Trainboy, Rod, and Jimmy. Your support means the world, folks. Any questions or anything, feel free, drop them in the old comment box below. My Instagram and Twitter are both linked there too. So, thank you very much for your time, one and all, and you all enjoy the rest of your day.